Hello, I'm Dr. Vanderpool and welcome to Business Communication. Today we're going to look at Chapter 1, which is titled Establishing a Framework for Business Communication. You can see I have my textbook in front of me. I hope you have yours in front of you because we're going to work through these chapters one page at a time, and I'm just going to share with you some things that I see in the chapters that I think are important. Obviously, just because I'm working through this doesn't mean I'm going to cover every detail. You must read the material yourself and be ready for the exam when it comes up. But I'm going to hit some of the major points in this Chapter 1, Establishing a Framework for Business Communication. Within the first paragraph, the textbook talks to us about the three purposes of communication. And these come to us from the ancient Greeks, who told us the three reasons we communicate is so that we may, first of all, entertain, secondly, educate, and third, persuade. The Greeks told us that the easiest level of communication is at the point of entertaining, and we see this all the time. We tend to entertain our friends and our loved ones, and we tell jokes, and we just talk and chat, and that's basically the entertainment level of communication. But the more difficult level of communication beyond entertaining is educating, where we're actually trying to present structured material in such a fashion that people remember it and are able to use that information, access it, and apply it to their lives. But the very most difficult type of communication the ancient Greeks talked to us about was persuasion, where we must change a person's mind, change their thinking, or change their behavior. Now, entertaining is easy. We do it, it just comes without thought. Educating is much more difficult. It takes a great deal of forethought and preparation to educate. But persuading takes not only forethought, but skill. We're going to be engaging in these last two parts of communication, the educating and the persuading. But business is primarily persuading, and it is a very difficult kind of communication. One of the problems I run into when I work with students and try and teach business communication is that they enter the classroom and say to themselves, well, I already know how to communicate. I can talk, I can write, and I can speak in front of a class, and I don't really need this class. But the fact is, you do need to develop your skills and your abilities so that you are the best persuader you can possibly be. And I liken it to this illustration. You can walk, you can run. Probably most of you can run a good race if you wanted to. But how many of you are ready for the Olympics? If you wanted to be in the Olympics, what you would have to do is go out and exercise and practice every day. You would go out and hire a coach, someone that could instruct you and could teach you and could help you to develop your skills, to be the very best that you could possibly be. So it is with business communication. If you're going to reach the highest level of communication, that of persuading, you need a coach, you need a teacher, you need practice, you need to develop your skills so that you're more than just the average person. You're going to communicate for a career, for an income. This is going to be your life. You want to be the best communicator you can be. So the ancient Greeks have taught us that we can entertain, we can educate, or we can persuade, and business communication is largely persuasion. Let's talk about communication in general and talk about a communication model. You'll see the introduction to this in the first page or two of your textbook, particularly on pages 4 and 5. It will talk about the communication model. And very simply, if you look at the illustration in the lower left-hand corner of page 4, it will give you an idea of what a communication is model. It'll give you an idea of a communication model. So imagine a large circle in front of you, and on the one side is the sender, and on the other side is the receiver. How do we get the messages from the sender over to the receiver? Well, the model goes like this. The sender will take their message, whatever it is, a persuasive message or instructional message, and they will encode their message into a language or a code that the receiver on the other side of the model will probably understand. Now we can use the English language or the French language or the German language, We can use smoke signals if we wanted to. We can use body language. We can use all kinds of different language. Facial cues, for example, are another way of encoding our message. Anything, any symbolic way we can picture our message and to get it across is encoding, E-N-C-O-D-I-N-G, our message. Then we transmit our message to the receiver who receives it, and before they understand in their own mind what our message is, they must take our encoded message and decode it, D-E-C-O-D-E, so that they can have an understanding of what we mean. So the receiver will encode a message. Let's take the word octopus. You understand how the word is a symbol of an actual thing. Octopus. They send it and the receiver receives it, and if they understand the word or the symbol octopus, they will get the same picture in their mind. And then the receiver will encode a response to whatever message we have sent, and they will send it back to us. We're completing a circle of encoding a message, the receiver decoding, working with that message, encoding their response, sending it back through a transmission channel. We decode that message, we think it through, give it a mind process, then we encode a response. So it's encode, decode, encode, decode. We just keep going back and forth until finally we bring our communication and our thoughts together. The textbook talks about barriers to communication. It actually, on that picture in the textbook, talks about interferences. And there are a number of different kinds of interferences. The textbook talks about the interference of demographics. Sometimes when young people, I'm talking junior high people, will talk to me, I don't quite understand their language. It's a different kind of jargon than I'm used to. Or if you get into a particular business that uses a lot of jargon, referencing computers, for example, some people may not fully understand that. So demographics, age, education levels, a lot of different issues can provide interferences to people understanding the message that is being sent. There can also be physical interferences, such as if a room is too hot where you are presenting, people are going to get tired, and you have to try to overcome that physical barrier. And also mental distractions. If we just recently came through the political elections for a president, and if I was going to address a crowd of people about the campaign, I would want to know, first of all, are these going to be Republicans or Democrats or a mixed crowd? I'm not going to take a Democratic message to a Republican crowd unless I know ahead of time and can prepare for that kind of a message. So looking at the kinds of interferences or distractions or barriers that get in the way of this communication model of encoding, decoding, encoding, decoding, encoding, decoding will help us to communicate even better. The textbook goes on and continues talking about communication flows within information, within organizations, and I'm going to cover this just very briefly. It talks about formal and informal channels. It also talks about grapevines and directions of communication flow. So let's cover each of those three just very quickly. First of all, the formal and informal channels is just a basic concept. The formal are those organized and structured messages which are communicated within organizations. The informal are those more social or psychological types of communication within an organization. Unstructured and unformatted, perhaps. Discussion around the water cooler would be an informal communication. A boss sending out an email to the workers would be a formal type of communication. There's a different kind of communication within organizations called a grapevine. And this is a very interesting term that comes to us. In the Civil War, they had just recently discovered the telegraph machine. And in order to telegraph messages from one location to another, they had to have a connection with a wire. They didn't have telephone poles back in those days. They hadn't discovered the telephone or invented it. And so what they had to do was run a wire from one telegraph machine to another telegraph machine. And if that wire ran for several miles, they couldn't just leave it on the ground. they would run it along fences, they would throw it up over trees, and these wires ran one direction, and then they would want to run another wire another direction, and after a while, wires were running and crisscrossing each other. One tree might have 14, 18, 20 different wires running from one location to another location, and when people looked up at that conglomeration of wires crisscrossing here and there, they called it a grapevine. It was great for communication back in those days, and we still use the same concept today. When people are communicating horizontally for the social, the informal messages within an organization, many times we call it a grapevine, and it has adapted itself in such a fashion that now many people seem to term it as a gossip. In fact, that's not always the case. We're not necessarily communicating gossip. It depends. If we communicate truth via the grapevine, we're still communicating truth. It's not gossip, but it's the kind of garbage in, garbage out concept that your communication channel is only as good as the kind of communication that is put within it. The third kind of communication we talk about is communication flow, upward, downward, and horizontal, or perhaps lateral. The downward communication is largely for the control, the top management trying to control the line workers. The upward communication is more for feedback, and then the horizontal is more for coordination of different activities within an organization. And we also talk about levels of communication, internal and external, within the organization and without the organization. Very briefly, I'd like to cover some of the strategic forces that influence business communication today. The textbook talks about 4 of these. Legal and ethical constraints. This is an interesting discussion within our textbook. Unfortunately, it's one of the shorter sections that we have. This is not an ethics textbook, but what we have in this short section is very important for communicators to know. We must be ethical communicators. Especially if we're working to persuade, we must have some ethics. We could persuade people to do things they may not want to do or are not good for them. And we must be careful to always try to persuade people to do that which is right and best for them. Take a look at some of the concepts in this section, starting with page 10 on the ethical issues. I would also point out the little chart at the top of page 12. Dimension 1, the 4 dimensions of business behavior. Dimension 1 is where behavior is illegal and unethical, and obviously it's not a place that any business person wants to be, being both illegal and unethical. Dimension 2 is behavior that is illegal but ethical, and we don't run into that very often. Dimension 3 is behavior that is both legal and yet unethical. Legal and unethical, and that's most of the time where we must spend our time trying to figure out what to do. It's legal, but is it ethical? And this section of the textbook will help you to know that. Dimension 4 is behavior that is both legal and ethical, and that's where we want to be. That's our comfort zone as business persons. Strategic force number 2 involving business communication today is the challenges of diversity. We run into cultural and situations that influence communication, so that we want to recognize that communication must overcome many challenges. Take a look at what ethnocentrism is and stereotypes, understanding that sometimes our body language, kinesics and proxemics, the position of space between people is very important and sometimes could be misunderstood through different cultures. Strategic force 3 is changing technology. We have an entire chapter coming up in which we will talk about how technology is changing the place where we work. And then strategic force number 4 is the team environment, where we pull people to work and have more teamwork activities. I would suggest that we see both task and relationship issues on most teams, where the team is working to achieve the task or achieve relationship, and sometimes there's a difference between them. We'll talk about that more as we move on. I invite you to look in Chapter 1 to do your best to understand it, and we'll look forward to seeing you again.